Well, I don't know, exactly how that fit into the whole mix. I'm sure it added something to.
And indeed, the national press did make a great deal of the fact that you, as the Republican whip, had written him this letter.
Yes, that's right. Because I decided later to release it to the press. After he had had plenty of time to have it and consider it, I did release it to the press. And then I thought some more, and I decided, having taken that step, that I was going to publicly, and I ultimately made a public statement, that I felt that it was in his interest and the country's interest for him to resign. And that was, of course, a major step, too, because that was a more direct statement.
And then President Nixon did make the decision to resign, and there was a very dramatic meeting that took place the night that he went on television to announce that resignation.
Thursday night of that week, he was to go on television at 9 o'clock and make an address. And he had invited a group of about 30 House and Senate members to a meeting in the cabinet room an hour before that. And I was rather surprised, having said what I said, that I was included, but I was. And it was one of those meetings that you'll never forget, because it's hard to describe, but he was very emotional. He went through a lot of irrelevancies, but at the end, he said, "I hope you won't feel that I've let you down." And then he kind of just collapsed, and his aides came to his side and helped him out of the room. And I couldn't believe that 30 minutes later he was going to be on national television, but he was, and he'd gotten himself together. That was a very moving. There were about 20 House members and 10 senators, people he felt very close to, I guess. At least that's the way it was, the way he put it.
What was your reaction then after the national television address and the following day?
Well, the following day, of course, he flew off to California with the black box, which he was going to control until the presidency was transferred.
Is that a little frightening in retrospect?
Something to think about, isn't it?
Indeed it is.
And of course, Jerry Ford was sworn in, and all of a sudden, our friend from Grand Rapids was no longer Jerry, he was Mr. President.
And indeed, this was a whole new era in a way for Michigan and Michigan politics,
Certainly
because
was.
Suddenly we had someone from Michigan in the White House, and suddenly people from Michigan really achieved new stature and new importance, including yourself.
That's for sure, yeah.
To what extent did Gerald Ford rely on you for advice in the early days?
Well, just being a leader of the Senate, of course, we met with him at least once a week, sometimes twice a week. And in addition to that, I was on his transition team as he was trying to move into the White House and get his staff in place. Some of the people he kept from the Nixon administration, but a lot of them he didn't. Mm-hmm. And I was on the team that helped to make those recommendations, at least to him. So I was very close to him.
In 1975, a year into his presidency, Gerald Ford came back to Michigan and visited Mackinac Island and the Cherry Festival here in Traverse City. Tell me your reminiscences about that great time when Jerry Ford visited
Well, I
this
remember
area.
being up in the personal quarters of the White House when I asked him if he'd come out and do this, and he gave me a hard time for a while, and then he finally said he would do it, and we were awfully happy he did. To my knowledge, it's the first time that a sitting president has ever visited Traverse City. As we're saying this, President Clinton, incidentally, is thinking about coming to Traverse City. He may do that. After he went through the parade downtown, we had a big reception out here at our place where we're holding this session today, and had a lot of the people from Traverse City out here to meet him and so forth. It was a great event. incidentally, the Secret Service came in about 3 or 4 days in advance. They took over our little guest house out there. They were up in the trees and out on the boats and looking all over the place, and they made quite a scene for the local people to see what the Secret Service does for the president. But anyway, after it was over and the cavalcade of the president was headed back to the airport, they got about 2 miles down the road, and one of our neighbors, Farmer Gallagher, all of a sudden his cows started to cross the road, and the whole cavalcade of the head of the free world stopped as the Gallagher cows went across the road. And there were the Gallagher children out there with signs saying, "Welcome, Mr. President, welcome, Betty." And we learned later that the kids had wanted to go to the parade. Gallagher said, "You've got to do your chores, but don't worry, we'll make sure that you get to see the president."
And there's one way to do that.
The Detroit papers had a big 3-column color photograph of that scene the next day, which was really fun.
A great story, a great story. Then in 1976, of course, President Ford had to seek the nomination for a new term, and although a lot of people have kind of forgotten this, he was hotly contested in that by Governor Ronald Reagan, and you played a major role in that Reagan-Ford 1976 battle.
Well, a few people may still remember seeing me on their television screens with my cap and waving signs and so forth. I was the floor manager for the Ford campaign in at that convention. And I remember sitting in the Michigan delegation wasn't close to the podium, and I had to be near the podium because of my responsibilities. So they put me in the Kansas delegation. I was in the front row of the Kansas delegation. And so I was seeing a lot of Bob Dole, incidentally, all the time. And we had a dickens of a time. I studied very hard the Eisenhower-Taft Republican convention and realized, of course, that there could be a test vote on something or other, and we had to be prepared for any particular vote that might come along. And sure enough, the Reagan people did come up with a gimmick, and Reagan announced that he would name Schweiker to be vice president.
Senator Richard Schweiker of Pennsylvania.
Right. And challenged Ford to announce his choice in advance. Well, Ford's strength was so diluted and divided, and having candidates for vice president in various states, we didn't want to do that. So we had to take that resolution head on and try to defeat it, and we barely did. And when that vote was over, we knew that Ford would get the nomination, and he did. Unfortunately, the Ford and the Reagan people didn't really get together strongly after that convention.
There was some doubt, in fact, that Ronald Reagan would join him on the podium.
Would even come to the podium, but finally he did.
And the nomination was won by less than 100 votes,
that's right.
I believe.
That's right.
Now, there's a story also as to Ford's process of selecting a vice presidential candidate.
Yeah. I was in a group, I think, of about 12 who met with Jerry after that, after the convention was over. And he had to announce the next day, of course. And he hadn't made up his mind, which wasn't unusual under those circumstances. I strongly recommended, as my first choice, Ann Armstrong, because I thought that Ford was so far behind that he really had to do something dramatic to shake up the numbers. And there was support for Ann, but some of the pollsters had numbers showing that a woman would, at that stage, would not do well and would really be a drag on the ticket, and so on. Our meeting ended up with 3 recommendations: Ann Armstrong, Howard Baker, and Bob Dole. And it was really left to Jerry Ford. He didn't want us to vote on it, but he ended up making that decision himself and selected Bob Dole.